the invitation. The town of Asheville was the kind of place that did not demand very much from you. It sat quietly between two low hills, the way an old cat sits between two cushions, settled, unhurried, entirely sure of its own comfort. Its streets were narrow and uneven, paved with stones that had been worn smooth by generations of unhurried footsteps. Its lampposts were old iron, slightly crooked, and they cast pools of warm amber light onto the pavement each evening without any fuss whatsoever. There was a bakery that had been run by the same family for 4 decades. There was a small library with a creaking wooden floor. There was a churchyard where the yew trees had grown so old and so wide that they seemed less like trees and more like permanent features of the landscape, as though the land itself had simply decided, one quiet century, to push something ancient and dark and beautiful upward through the soil and leave it there forever. Alara had lived in Asheville for 11 years. She had come here originally for what she told herself was a temporary reason, a job, a change, a need to be somewhere quieter while certain things in her life sorted themselves out. But the years had passed in that way they sometimes do, where each individual one seems quite manageable and even brief. And then you look up and discover that a considerable number of them have gone by without your full permission. 11 years. She was 38 now. She had a job she was good at, a house she had made comfortable, a small circle of people she trusted, and a life that was, by any reasonable measure, a good one. And yet, there is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with how many hours you have slept. It does not come from late nights or early mornings. It is not the tiredness of the body, though the body often carries it anyway, in the shoulders, in the space behind the eyes, in the way the hands feel slightly heavier than they should at the end of an ordinary day. It is the tiredness that comes from being fully, continuously present in a world that asks a great deal and gives back its rewards in forms that are often invisible, often delayed, often difficult to feel even when you know intellectually they are there. It is the tiredness of caring deeply and working hard and doing all of it correctly and still arriving at the end of most days with the faint and puzzling sensation that something essential has been quietly spent without being replenished. Alara knew this tiredness well. She had known it for a while now. She did not complain about it because she also knew that she was lucky, and she was not the kind of person who failed to notice her own luck. But knowing you are lucky and feeling genuinely rested are not the same thing, and she had spent long enough pretending they were. She worked as an editor for a small publishing house that operated out of a converted Georgian townhouse 2 streets over from the library. It was work she had chosen deliberately and loved genuinely. The careful, intimate work of sitting with someone else's words and helping them become the truest version of themselves. She was good at it in the way that people are good at things they were quietly made for. Her instincts were sound. Her attention was reliable. Authors trusted her in that specific, slightly vulnerable way that people trust someone who has read their unfinished sentences and not flinched. But editing, for all its quietness, is not a quiet occupation. It requires a sustained and particular kind of attention that draws on something deep, some reservoir of perception and sensitivity that does not have unlimited capacity, and that, if not carefully maintained, begins to run low in ways you feel before you can name. By October of that year, Alara's reservoir was low. She knew it because the words on the pages she was working with had begun to feel slightly distant, as though she were reading them through gauze. She knew it because she had started waking at 3 in the morning for no apparent reason, and lying in the dark with her thoughts moving in slow, repetitive circles, like water finding no outlet. She knew it because she had stood in her kitchen one Sunday morning, kettle in hand, and realized she could not remember whether she had already filled it. Small things, ordinary things, but the kind of small, ordinary things that are telling you something if you are paying the right kind of attention. The afternoon of the 14th of October was a Tuesday, which meant it was one of the days Alara worked from home. Her house was a narrow, 2-story stone cottage that sat at the outermost edge of the residential part of Asheville, where the town did not so much end as simply thin out. The houses growing gradually more spaced, the gardens larger, the sounds of the street growing softer and less frequent, until there were only fields, and then the beginning of the trees. Her garden was not large, but it was deep, and it backed up directly against the first real line of the woodland that spread, unchecked and unhurried, for several miles beyond the town's edge. She had spent the day working. She had spent it well, with focus, with competence, with the reliable professional part of herself that continued to function even when the rest of her was running at reduced capacity. She had read through 40 pages of a manuscript she was halfway through, made notes in the margins in her careful, slanted handwriting, sent 3 emails, and eaten lunch at her desk while answering a 4th. By 4 o'clock, the afternoon light had shifted from gold to something thinner and more amber, and the shadows in the garden had grown long and blue. She made tea. She stood at her kitchen window while the kettle boiled and looked out at the garden and at the trees beyond it, and she noticed that the leaves were doing that thing they do in mid-October, where they seem to glow from inside, a deep, impossible amber, as though each one contains a small private fire that is using up its last reserves of warmth before the cold comes. It was beautiful in a way that required you to be still in order to see it properly. Alara was still. She looked at the trees for a long time. The kettle clicked off. She made the tea. She carried it to her desk and did not go back to work. Instead, she sat, which was something she almost never did, sat without a book, without her phone, without a manuscript in her lap. She sat and held the warm mug in both hands and looked at the middle distance in the way that is not quite looking at anything. And she allowed herself to feel how tired she was. Not to fix it, not to think about what to do about it, simply to feel it, the way you might press gently on a bruise. Not to hurt yourself, but just to locate the shape of it, to know with some precision where it is. It was considerable, she discovered. It was larger than she had been acknowledging. It sat behind her sternum and in the muscles along the tops of her shoulders, and in a particular quality of dullness behind her eyes. She acknowledged it. She did not apologize to herself for it, or feel guilty about it, or immediately start making a plan. She just sat with it for a moment, which was already more than she usually allowed herself. Then she finished her tea and got up and went to put the mug in the sink. And that was when she noticed the envelope. She almost missed it entirely. It was on the doorstep, which she could see from the kitchen window at a certain angle, and she happened to glance in that direction at the right moment. It was the color that caught her eye, ivory, very pale, almost luminous in the fading afternoon light, tucked between the two large terracotta pots that flanked her front door. The pots held rosemary bushes that had grown surprisingly large over the years, and that smelled, on warm days, of something almost medicinal in its cleanness. The envelope was nestled between them, as though it had been placed with some care, the way you would set down something you did not want to damage. She set her mug in the sink and went to the front door. When she opened it, the air that came in smelled of the afternoon, of turned earth, of cold stone, of leaves, and the faint sweet decay that comes with autumn. She looked along the path to the small gate, and then beyond it to the street. There was no one. A bicycle was leaning against the wall of the house across the way. A cat sat on a garden wall further down, watching nothing in particular with the serene self-possession that cats have made their signature. The street was otherwise empty. She bent down and picked up the envelope. It was heavier than she expected. The paper was thick, genuinely thick, not the standard weight approximation of quality that you find in stationery shops, but the real thing, the kind that has substance and texture, and takes the light differently depending on the angle. It was ivory, or perhaps the faintest possible blush of cream, and it was sealed on the back with wax. The wax was the color of old copper, and it had been pressed into a stamp in the shape of a fern, not a simplified decorative fern, but a precise and botanically accurate one, with every frond and pinule rendered with the kind of attention that suggested either a very fine seal or a very steady hand. Her name was on the front, written in ink the color of moss, not green exactly, but the specific dark gray-green of moss in shadow, the color of something that has grown slowly in a quiet place, was simply Elara. Not her full name, not her address, just her name, written as though whoever had written it had no doubt whatsoever that it would reach her. She stood in her open doorway for a moment, the envelope in both hands, and felt something she had not felt in some time: curiosity. Pure, uncomplicated, slightly wondering curiosity. The kind that lives in the chest, just below the collarbone, and makes the breath come a little differently. She had not felt it so cleanly in a while. She was aware of its presence now with a kind of startled gratitude. She went inside. She sat down in the armchair by the window, the good one, the one with the slightly worn armrests that she had reupholstered herself 3 years ago in a fabric the color of old moss. And she broke the fern seal carefully, not wanting to damage it. Inside was a single sheet of the same ivory paper, folded twice. The handwriting was the same moss-colored ink, the same careful, unhurried script, not calligraphy precisely, but the kind of handwriting that has been formed by someone who considers what they are writing before they write it, and who is not in any particular rush. It said, "You are invited. The forest is ready for you. Follow the path where the fireflies gather at dusk. Come as you are. Bring nothing you do not need. Leave behind anything that has been weighing on you. Rest is not a reward. It is a return. The door will be open." That was all. She read it once. She read it again, slowly, in the way you read something when your mind is trying to catch up with what your heart has already understood. There was no signature. There was no address, no contact details, no explanation of who had sent it, or how they had known her name, or what exactly they were inviting her to. There was nothing that would satisfy any reasonable question about its origin. And yet, she did not feel suspicious. She did not feel alarmed. She was aware, in some quiet and observant part of herself, that this was notable, that a reasonable person, finding an unsigned invitation with no return address, might feel some degree of wariness, and that she felt none. What she felt instead was something she could only describe, if she were trying to be precise about it, as recognition. Not of the handwriting, not of the words, not of the sender. Recognition of the feeling behind them, as though something in the note knew her, knew the particular texture of her tiredness, the specific shape of what she needed, and was addressing her not as a stranger, but as someone it had been expecting to hear from for a while. Rest is not a reward. It is a return. She read that line a third time and sat with it. There was something in it that settled somewhere specific inside her, settled and stayed, the way a true thing does. She had spent years treating rest as something to be earned, a destination you arrived at after sufficient productivity, a prize for the completion of enough items on enough lists. She had not, she realized now, in quite some time, rested simply because rest was necessary. Simply because she was a person and persons require it. Simply because the body and the mind are not engines, but living things. And living things need more than fuel. They need stillness. They need the particular kind of quiet that allows something to come back. Outside the window, the amber leaves continued their slow drift. The afternoon was deepening. In an hour, maybe less, the dusk would come, that particular autumn dusk that is not dark so much as softened, the light thickening and warming before it fades, the air acquiring that quality of held breath that belongs to the precise moment between day and evening. The fireflies gather at dusk. She had seen fireflies in her garden before, in the warmer months. They came in from the woodland at the back, rising from the long grass at the garden's edge in the evenings, particularly after rain. She had not thought of them as a path before. She had only watched them as you watch beautiful things, with a pleasure that does not ask questions. She folded the letter back along its original creases and held it in her lap. She looked out at the garden. The long-shadowed October light lay across the grass in stripes, and the trees at the far end glowed, and the rosemary in the pots by the door was still fragrant on the cooling air. She was aware of her own heartbeat, not racing, not anxious, only present, only a little more alive than it had been an hour ago. She thought briefly and practically about the things she should probably do. There was still work on her desk. There was an email she had not answered. There was the ordinary apparatus of a Tuesday evening dinner, the small necessary tidying of a day, perhaps reading for an hour before bed. All of it real, all of it valid, all of it entirely possible to attend to. And then she thought about the envelope, and the moss-green handwriting, and the fern seal, and the words, "You are invited." She could not have explained, in any terms that would have satisfied a logical inquiry, why she believed the invitation was genuine. She could not have explained where she thought it came from, or what exactly she expected to find if she followed a path into her own back garden at dusk and looked for fireflies. She could not have explained why, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she felt not the faint gray weight of obligation and accumulated weariness, but something lighter and more awake. A quiet but unmistakable aliveness, as though some part of her that had been waiting patiently in a dim corner had looked up and said, "Oh, yes, this." She got up from the armchair. She went upstairs and changed out of her work clothes, the good trousers, the soft jumper she wore for sitting at a desk, and put on instead the things she would wear for an evening walk, comfortable trousers, a long-sleeved shirt in a washed-out blue that had softened with many washings, a light jacket the color of heather. She put on her softest shoes, the ones she wore when she wanted to feel the ground properly. She brushed her hair and left it down. She did not take her phone. This was not a dramatic decision. She simply looked at it, sitting on the kitchen counter, and felt no particular need to bring it. It would be there when she returned. She went to her back door, the one that led out into the garden, and through the low gate at the garden's far end into the meadow that bordered the woodland. She stood with her hand on the door handle for a moment and looked through the glass. The dusk was beginning. The sky above the trees had turned to the color of a bruised peach. Soft purples and golds layered over each other in the west, while above, the blue was deepening steadily toward its evening self. The garden was all shadow and amber, the grass long at the edges, the last of the summer's plants standing in their end-of-season attitudes, beautiful in their fatting. A single blackbird was singing from somewhere in the hedgerow, its song clear and unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world for this particular evening. And then, at the far end of the garden, where the grass grew long and the gate stood open onto the meadow beyond, she saw the first one, a single light floating just above the grass. Very small, very steady, the warm yellow-green of something alive, something that generates its own light from within. It drifted upward slowly, tracing a gentle curve in the cooling air. Then another and another. They rose one at a time at first, and then in small clusters, and then, as the dusk deepened, another shade, in their dozens, lifting from the long grass like sparks from a fire that no one had lit, like tiny souls ascending from some patient, unhurried source. They gathered and drifted and pulsed with their soft, cold fire, and they moved, she noticed, not randomly, but in a direction, drifting westward along the meadow's edge, and then curving into the first darkness of the trees, as though they were going somewhere, as though they knew the way. Alara opened the door and stepped out into the garden. The evening air met her cool and damp, and sweet with the smell of the earth, of the last roses, of the wood smoke that was beginning to drift from somewhere in the town behind her. The blackbird sang its unhurried notes. The sky went on deepening above the trees. She walked down through the garden, through the long gate, and into the meadow where the fireflies rose and gathered and drifted, and she followed them. She did not know, as she walked into the soft October dark, with 100 small lights moving gently before her, that she was walking toward the most restful night of her life. She did not know what waited at the end of the path the fireflies were drawing through the dark. She only knew the grass under her feet and the cool air on her face and the extraordinary sensation of having, for once, left everything behind: the desk, the emails, the accumulation of days, and stepped into an evening that belonged only to her. Ahead, the trees waited, and somewhere within them, something warm and quiet and deeply good was already lit, already ready, already expecting her. The walk through evening mist. The meadow was wider than she remembered. That was the first thing she noticed. The way the land seemed to have expanded in the evening, the way spaces do when the light changes, and the familiar geometry of daylight gives way to something softer and less defined. She had crossed this meadow before, on afternoon walks in summer, when it was bright and straightforward, and she could see the tree line clearly from the garden gate. It had always seemed a modest distance, 10 minutes perhaps, from gate to woodland edge. A pleasant enough crossing, nothing remarkable. But this evening it felt different. Not larger in a way that alarmed her, not the disorienting vastness of being lost or turned around, but larger in the way that good music feels longer than it is, or a bath taken without hurrying fills more time than the clock suggests. The meadow had room in it tonight. It breathed. It allowed for slowness. She was walking slowly, which was itself unusual. Alara was not, as a general rule, a slow walker. She walked the way she did most things efficiently, purposefully, with a direction in mind, and some portion of her attention already at her destination. It was not that she was impatient, exactly. It was simply that her body had learned, over many years, to treat movement as a form of productivity, a way of getting from one necessary thing to the next. Even her walks in the evening, which she took partly for the pleasure of them, had a quality of directed intention, a route, a pace, a mild awareness of time. But tonight she was not walking that way. Tonight her feet were finding their own pace, which turned out to be considerably gentler than her usual one, and her body was moving through the cool air with a looseness she had not quite noticed she was capable of. There was no destination pulling at her. There was only the meadow, and the dark, and the fireflies ahead, and the extraordinary quiet luxury of having nowhere to be except here. The grass was long and slightly wet at the edges of the path. Wet with that particular early evening moisture that collects on tall grass in October, the kind that soaks through fabric quickly and pleasantly, making itself known without being cold. She could feel it against her ankles as she walked, and the sensation was grounding in the most literal sense. It connected her to the specific, physical reality of where she was, the specific temperature and texture of this particular evening, as opposed to the generalized, slightly abstract place that most of her days were spent in, the interior world of screens and words and thoughts and plans. She was here. She was in a meadow. The grass was wet, The air smelled of earth. These were simple facts, and she allowed them to be simple. She did not think about the manuscript on her desk. She did not rehearse tomorrow's obligations. She only walked and felt the grass and followed the lights. The fireflies were extraordinary. She had seen them before, of course, those summer evenings in the garden, the occasional drifting light above the hedgerow at dusk. But she had never seen them like this, never in this number, never moving with such apparent coherence. They filled the air before her in a loose, gently pulsing cloud, each one its own small, warm light, and together they created something that was not quite a path, and not quite a flock, and not quite a constellation, but had qualities of all three. They floated and rose and dipped and converged and spread, and the overall movement of them was westward and forward, deeper into the evening, toward the trees. She watched them as she walked and felt again that sensation she had experienced when reading the letter, the clean, simple feeling of wondering, of not knowing what came next and finding that, for once, not knowing felt like an opening rather than a deficiency. She was used to knowing. Her work required it. Her days were structured around it. But walking through a darkening meadow, following fireflies toward a woodland she had never entered at night, she found that the not knowing was not only tolerable, but genuinely pleasant, like the first page of a book, whose story you cannot yet predict. The mist came gradually. She did not notice exactly when it began, because it did not arrive so much as accumulate, gathering itself from the ground upward in the way that evening mist does in low meadows near woodland, beginning as the faintest possible suggestion of haziness at ankle height, and building slowly and without fuss into something present and visible and real. By the time she was 2/3 of the way across the meadow, it was at her knees. By the time she reached the meadow's far edge, where the path narrowed and the ground cover changed from grass to a softer, more moss-mixed surface, it was at her waist. It was not cold. That was the thing about this particular mist. It was not the sharp, damp cold of a November fog, or the clammy chill of low cloud descending. It was mild, almost warm, in fact, or at least not cool, and it moved around her with a gentleness that felt, if you were inclined toward that kind of thought, intentional. It softened the edges of everything it touched, the dark shapes of the trees ahead, the remaining glow of the western sky above, the fireflies themselves, which moved through it as small warm blurs, their light diffused and rounded by the moisture in the air. Everything became softer. Everything became less sharp. The world simplified itself, gradually and kindly, down to the things immediately present. The ground underfoot, the cool air on her face above the mist line, the lights ahead, the sound of her own breathing. She breathed more deeply than usual. She noticed this, the way her lungs were taking more air more slowly, as though her body had decided, without consulting her, that this was the appropriate rhythm for this place and this evening. The air tasted of green things and cool water, and the faint, sweet earthiness that woodlands exhale at night. A smell that has no precise name, but that does something to the nervous system, something settling, something old and reliable, as though the body recognizes it from a time before cities and schedules and the particular pressures of modern life, as though somewhere in the deep animal memory of being human, this smell means you are safe here. Nothing is required of you here. You can stop being vigilant now. Her shoulders moved again, lower this time, more decidedly. She had not realized, until this moment, how much of her physical existence was lived in her upper body, specifically in that band of muscle across the tops of her shoulders and along the back of her neck, where tension gathers and is stored, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, sometimes long enough that it stops feeling like tension and starts feeling like simply the way that part of the body is. She had been carrying something there for long enough that she had stopped registering it as anything other than normal. But here, in the cool and the mist and the quiet, something in that region was releasing, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the incremental way that genuinely held things release, slowly, and with a kind of reluctant relief. She rotated her neck gently. She felt the small protests of joints and muscles that had been held too still for too long. She breathed into it and breathed again and walked on. The path entered the trees. The transition from meadow to woodland was not abrupt. It was a gradual thing, the grass becoming shorter and more mixed with moss and low plants, the occasional young birch or hazel appearing on either side of the path, then more of them, then older trees behind those, until she found herself properly enclosed by woodland without having been able to identify the exact moment the enclosure began. This is how good things often arrive, she thought, not with a clear threshold you can point to, but with a gradual deepening that you only recognize as significant when you look up and find yourself already somewhere new. The trees here were old. She could sense their age before she could see it clearly in the low light. The way old trees have a quality of presence that younger ones do not. Something in the weight of the air around them. Something in the way the silence sits differently near them, thicker and more considered. The oaks were enormous, their trunks wider than she could have reached around, their bark deeply furrowed and covered in patches of pale lichen that glowed faintly in the dark. The branches above her were vast and intricate, a canopy of interlocking complexity that the fireflies navigated with ease, weaving between the limbs in their gentle, pulsing way. The mist was thinner here, under the trees. The canopy above held it back somewhat, and the forest floor deep with years of accumulated leaf fall, soft and springy, and smelling intensely of earth and decay, and the particular richness of decomposing things becoming new things was clear enough that she could see where she was walking. The path was there, or something was there, not a formal path, not a constructed thing, but the kind of way that forms through years of something passing. Animals, perhaps, or weather, or simply the preference of the land itself for one direction over another. It was narrow and clear and soft underfoot, and the fireflies followed it, and she followed the fireflies. The sounds of the woodland settled around her. An owl, not close, far enough that the call arrived rounded and softened by distance. That low, hollow resonance that owls make when they are not alarmed, but only present, only announcing their existence to the night. She stopped walking when she heard it and stood very still, her head tilted slightly, listening. It called again, then was silent. Then, from a different direction, further away, something answered, a smaller sound, a different register. The conversation of two creatures who had no particular urgency, but were keeping each other located in the dark. She listened until both were silent, then walked on. Water somewhere. The sound of it was faint at first, just a quality in the air, a suggestion of moving water rather than the thing itself, and then gradually more present as she walked. Not a river, something smaller, a stream perhaps, running over stones in the dark, somewhere below and to her left. Its sound coming up through the trees with that particular clarity that water sounds have at night, when other sounds have diminished, and the ears, freed from their daytime task of filtering constant input, can reach further and more precisely. She listened to it as she walked, and felt it doing something to the inside of her chest. Some kind of loosening, some settling of the particular kind of internal noise that is not sound, but that functions like sound, the low continuous background frequencies of worry and planning and self-monitoring that run almost constantly in the minds of busy, conscientious people, and that are so habitual they become nearly inaudible until, in a moment of genuine quiet, you notice their absence and realize how much energy they have been consuming. The stream, the owl, the soft compression of leaf fall underfoot, her own breathing. That was all. And it was, she discovered, more than enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. It was the precise quantity of sensation that the mind can receive without being overwhelmed, enough to be occupied, enough to stay present. Not so much that it needs to start organizing and prioritizing and filing things away for later. It was the sensory equivalent of the right amount of light in a room. Not too bright, not too dim, but the kind that allows you to simply be in the space without effort she had been walking for She was not sure how long. She had not brought her phone, which meant she had no clock, and she found that the absence of a clock was doing something interesting to her experience of time. Without the ability to check the time, she had stopped trying to track it, and without tracking it, she had stopped experiencing it in the way she usually did, as a resource being spent, a limited quantity moving in one direction, each minute a small subtraction from whatever total remained before the next obligation. Time, here, in the dark of the old woodland, was simply the medium she was moving through. It passed, presumably, at its usual rate, but it no longer felt like it was passing in the direction of anything particular. It simply was, as the trees simply were, as the stream simply was, as the cool air on her face simply was. She was profoundly relaxed. The recognition of this came to her not as an announcement, but as a quiet observation, the way you notice that the rain has stopped not because you were listening for it, but because at some point the sound of it was simply no longer there. She was relaxed. Her body was moving through the dark woodland with a looseness and ease she recognized from certain rare and specific moments. The beginning of a deep sleep, the middle of a very long bath, the afternoon of a day off after a long stretch of work, when the mind finally accepts that it can put things down. She was here, and she was moving, and she was not tired in the depleted, gray way she had been tired for weeks. She was tired in the clean, honest, physical way of someone who has been walking in cool air. A tiredness that knows it has a good destination and is entirely comfortable with that knowledge. The fireflies were fewer now, or at least more spread out. The great cloud of them that had escorted her across the meadow had dispersed somewhat into the trees. Individual lights here and there among the branches, occasional clusters near the ground where the undergrowth was thickest. But ahead of her, perhaps 40 or 50 yards further along the path, a concentration of them was visible. A soft, warm brightening in the dark, as though a group of them had gathered around something or near something, their collective light enough to render a small area of the woodland noticeably warmer in color. She walked toward it. As she walked, she noticed more details of the woodland around her. A fallen tree, enormous, its trunk as wide as a small car, covered entirely in moss of a green so vivid it seemed to generate its own faint light. A cluster of pale mushrooms at the base of an oak, their caps perfectly formed, perfectly still, as though they had been placed there with care. The roots of an old beech tree, vast and spreading above the ground, creating a landscape of ridges and hollows that the fireflies seemed to enjoy. Several of them drifting low between the roots in their unhurried way. She thought about the letter again, about the words she had read in her armchair with the amber October light coming through the window. Rest is not a reward. It is a return. She turned the phrase over in her mind as she walked and found it settling deeper with each repetition, finding more resonance the more she considered it. A return, not an escape, not a withdrawal, not a giving up or a giving in. A return as in the thing you come back to, as in the original state, as in the thing that was always there, waiting, underneath all the accumulation. She had been away from herself, she realized. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to anyone watching from outside, but the way a room can be slowly filled with things over years, until the space that makes it a room, the empty air that allows it to function, is quietly reduced. She had been slowly filling herself with obligations and outputs and careful, sustained attention, until the quiet interior space that makes a person themselves had become rather crowded. Not gone, only crowded, only waiting for some of the things to be temporarily removed. The woodland was removing them. One by one, very gently, the way a careful hand removes things from a shelf. This worry, this plan, this half-formed anxiety about the email she had not sent, this residue of a conversation from 3 days ago that had not sat entirely right. The trees and the dark and the cool air and the sound of the stream were taking these things and holding them somewhere outside her for a while, not discarding them. They would be there when she returned. Those were her things, and she would deal with them, but simply giving her an evening without them. Simply saying, "You don't need to carry all of this right now." She exhaled slowly. A long breath, longer than usual, going all the way to the bottom of her lungs, and then beyond, into that last reserve of air that almost never gets used during the shallow, efficiency-focused breathing of a busy day. She let it all out and stood still for a moment in the dark, empty of breath, and felt the curious and wonderful lightness of having completely exhaled, and then breathed back in, deep and slow. And the air that came in was cool and green and clean, and tasted of the earth and the night. She stood there for a moment, breathing. Then she looked up through a gap in the canopy above and saw the stars. She had not looked for them until now. She had been looking forward and downward, following the path, following the lights, attending to the ground and the immediate middle distance. But she looked up now, and there they were, not the faint, slightly washed out stars that are all you usually get near a town, even a small one, even one as quiet as Asheville, but proper stars, sharp and numerous, the sky between them very black and very clear. She could see the form of the night sky properly, the particular depth of it, the way the stars are not all the same distance, the way looking into a clear night sky is actually looking through layers of depth, so enormous the mind can gesture at them, but cannot really hold them. She looked up at the stars for a long time, She did not try to name them. She did not think about what she knew about them. She only looked in the way that people look at beautiful things when they have stopped being in a hurry, openly, without agenda, with a quality of simple reception that is one of the best things a person can do with their eyes. When she lowered her head, the concentration of firefly light was closer now, very close, perhaps 20 yards, softly illuminating a space between the trees that seemed, as she drew near, to be a kind of threshold. The trees on either side were particularly old, their trunks leaning slightly toward each other over the path, their branches interlocking above in a natural arch. Between them, the path continued, and beyond them, the firefly light was warmest, and with the light now came something else, something she had not noticed until she was close enough for it to reach her. Warmth, a gentle warmth, coming from somewhere ahead. Not the warmth of a fire, not the dry heat of something burning, but something softer than that, the warmth of steam, perhaps, or of heated stone, a warmth that carried on the air with it, a scent she could not immediately identify, but that was somehow familiar in the way of things encountered in childhood and not thought of since. Herbs, and something mineral, and something faintly floral, and beneath all of it, the clean, sweet smell of running water made warm. She paused at the threshold of the arching trees and looked ahead. The path curved gently to the left, and around the curve, the trees thinned, and the sky opened above, and the fireflies rose around the edges of what she now saw was a clearing. Not large, not dramatic, but deeply, perfectly proportioned, as though it had been shaped by someone who understood exactly how much space was needed for a person to feel held, but not confined, enclosed, but not trapped. The clearing was rimmed with old trees and cushioned with moss, and at its center, lit by the gathered fireflies and by something warmer and more golden that came from within a structure at the clearing's far edge, was the beginning of what waited for her. She could see the pale stone of it, the dark wood, the wisteria. She could see the amber glow of windows. She could see the steam rising, soft and white, curling upward into the night air. She stood at the threshold for a long moment. She was breathing slowly. Her shoulders were as low as they could go. Her hands, which had been gently fisted at her sides for most of the walk, not tensely, only in the way that hands are when their owner is still carrying some last residue of the day, opened slowly, fingers relaxing, palms turning slightly upward in a gesture she had not consciously chosen, as though her hands too were releasing something, letting the last of it go. The evening air held her, cool and fragrant and still, and she walked forward through the threshold into the clearing. She did not know yet what waited inside those amber-lit rooms, what hands would attend to her, what warm waters would receive her, what particular stillness the night had prepared. She knew only what she felt in this moment, stepping out of the old trees and into the gentle firefly-lit clearing. That she had been given something rare tonight, that something in the world, in the particular and improbable goodness of the world, had looked at her tiredness and her carrying and her quiet years of giving, and had written her name in moss-colored ink on ivory paper, and had led her, gently and without hurry, through an October evening to a place where the only thing asked of her was to arrive. She had arrived. She stepped forward, and the door, as promised, was open. Arrival at the hidden spa. The clearing held its breath. That was the sensation, as though the entire space, the trees ringing its edges, the moss-covered ground, the cool night air gathered between the old oaks and the weeping willows, had drawn itself in gently at the moment she stepped through the threshold, and was now simply waiting, very quietly, to see what she would do next. It was not an uncomfortable feeling. It was not the held breath of anticipation, not the suspended quality of a moment before something loud or sudden. It was the held breath of recognition. The way a room feels when it has been prepared for someone, and that someone has finally walked through the door. She stood at the edge of the clearing and let it settle around her. The space was perhaps 40 yards across, circular in the way that only truly natural clearings are circular. Not perfectly, not geometrically, but with that organic approximation of roundness that suggests the shape has arrived over time through the gradual negotiation of trees and light and the slow preferences of growing things. The ground was almost entirely moss, not the sparse, patchy moss of shaded garden corners, but deep, established, continuous moss. The kind that has been growing undisturbed for decades, that has achieved a depth and density and evenness that makes it look less like a plant and more like a surface, like something the earth has decided to upholster itself within this particular place. It was very dark in color at this hour, almost black in the shadows, but where the firefly light touched it, it glowed a deep and extraordinary green, the color of something alive and deeply rooted. The weeping willows she had glimpsed from the path were larger than she had realized. They stood at 3 points around the clearing's edge, their long pale branches descending to within inches of the moss in long, trailing curtains that moved very slightly in the air, as though they were breathing. She had always found weeping willows to be among the most quietly affecting of trees. There was something in the particular quality of their drooping that was not sorrowful, as the name suggested, but rather deeply at ease, as though they had made some fundamental decision to simply let everything hang loose, to stop holding anything upright, to practice a kind of total, committed relaxation that most living things never quite achieve. They suited this place entirely. The building sat at the far edge of the clearing, with the confidence of something that has always been exactly where it is. It was low, only one story, or perhaps slightly more in certain places, where the roofline rose gently, and it spread itself along the clearing's edge in a wide, unhurried way, as though it had grown there rather than been built, the way a long, comfortable thought spreads itself through the mind without apology for taking up room. The walls were pale stone, limestone, she thought, or something similar, the kind of stone that holds the warmth of the day long after the sun has gone, and gives it back slowly and generously in the dark. The color of it in the firefly light was extraordinary, a warm pale gray with traces of gold and rose in it, as though the stone itself remembered light. The wood of the building was dark, not painted, not treated to any artificial color, but naturally dark in the way of old timber that has weathered and silvered over years, until it reaches that shade that is between gray and brown and black, a color that has no single satisfying name, but that feels ancient and reliable. The wood framed the windows, and the entrance, and the low overhanging eaves, and the contrast between the pale stone and the dark wood was quietly beautiful. The kind of beauty that does not announce itself or ask for attention, but simply exists, the way the proportions of a good face exist, as something you feel before you consciously register it. The wisteria was everywhere. It had been growing for a long time, clearly. The main stems at the corners of the building were as thick as her wrist in places, twisted and woody, and bearing the particular authority of plants that have been somewhere so long they have become part of the architecture rather than a decoration upon it. The smaller stems spread out from these in every direction, climbing the stone, framing the windows, arching over the entrance in a canopy so dense and interwoven that in spring or summer it must have been staggering. A building nearly consumed by blossom, nearly hidden under the cascade of those long purple flower clusters that wisteria produces with such extravagant generosity. Now, in October, the leaves were turning, fading from their summer green to a pale and luminous yellow gold that caught the warm light from the windows and added its own soft glow to everything, so that the entire building seemed to be very gently lit from two sources simultaneously. From within, by whatever warmth burned inside those amber windows, and from without, by the last golden gesture of the wisteria before winter. The steam came from the right-hand side of the building, from somewhere she could not yet see, curling upward in slow, soft columns that rose into the night air and dissipated gradually into the dark sky above. It was the most visible evidence of warmth, of water being heated somewhere in this place, and she watched it for a moment with a feeling she would have struggled to articulate. But that was something in the region of profound welcome, the feeling of a cold traveler seeing lit windows and smoke from a chimney. The body knows what warmth means. The body responds to the evidence of it before the mind has finished processing anything. The fireflies were thickest here around the building. They clustered near the wisteria and drifted along the low eaves and gathered in soft, glowing groups near the entrance, as though they too found the building attractive, as though they too were drawn to whatever warmth and light originated there. In their dozens, they floated and pulsed, and in their light, the entrance to the building was gently, warmly illuminated, a wide wooden door, dark and solid, standing open precisely as the letter had promised. She crossed the clearing. Her feet on the deep moss made almost no sound at all. This was one of the most immediately noticeable things. The quality of the silence here, which was not the thin silence of an empty room, or the silence of a place where sound has been suppressed, but the full, layered silence of a place that is itself quiet, deeply and structurally quiet. The silence of old trees and soft ground, and the absence of any road within considerable distance. Into this silence, the small sounds of the evening were not intrusions, but elaborations. The gentle settling of the wisteria against the stone, the barely audible breath of the steam as it rose, the fireflies, which she could have sworn made a sound when you were close to them. Not a sound, exactly, but a quality of vibration in the air, something at the lower edges of hearing, or perhaps below hearing entirely, felt more than perceived. She walked to the door and stood before it. It was a beautiful door. She had not expected to have a feeling about a door, but she did. It was old wood, very dark, with the kind of surface that comes from decades of hands touching it. Not smooth in the manufactured way of finished surfaces, but smooth in the organic way of wood that has been worn by use into something that fits the human hand almost perfectly. The grain of it was visible even in this light, rising and falling in long curves like the contour lines of a landscape seen from above. There was no handle, only a simple iron latch, old and slightly darkened, and the door was open by perhaps a foot, enough to suggest welcome, enough to allow the warmth and light from within to reach her, not so wide as to feel abandoned or careless. It was the opening of a door by someone who had recently stepped away from it, but expected you any moment. From inside, warmth. It arrived at her face first, a gentle, enveloping warmth, the kind that a well-heated stone building retains and radiates with a steadiness that no mechanical heating system quite replicates. It was not hot. It was not the aggressive warmth of somewhere overheated. It was the warmth of somewhere that has been warm for a very long time, that has absorbed heat into its walls and floors and furnishings, and releases it as a continuous, gentle, deeply reliable gift. It was the warmth that the word refuge points at, if you think about it long enough. With the warmth came scent. she identified them one by one, in the way her editorial mind organized incoming information, even in moments of pure sensory experience. Though she was doing it gently tonight, without effort, without the usual professional precision. Beeswax first, the warm honey sweet of candles that have been burning for some time in an enclosed space. Cedar underneath that not sharp, not intrusive, but the deep background scent of a building whose bones are partly cedar, whose walls and floors and shelves carry the wood's fragrance permanently, released slowly and continuously into the air. And beneath these, something herbal, complex, layered, warm, something that she associated immediately and involuntarily with the word healing. Not because she knew exactly which plants it came from, but because her body responded to it with an instinctive relaxation, a small but perceptible deepening of ease. She put her hand against the open door and stepped inside. The entrance hall was small, not cramped, small in the way of spaces that have been designed with care to be exactly the right size, no larger than necessary, fitted so precisely to their purpose that they feel complete. The floor was stone, the same pale limestone as the exterior walls, and it was warm. She felt it through the soles of her shoes, an unmistakable warmth rising upward from the floor itself, which was heated from below. She understood, by some system buried in the foundation. She had heard of such things. She had never stood on such a floor before now, and the effect of it was immediate and physical and almost embarrassingly pleasurable. Warmth coming from the ground upward, meeting the warmth of the air, meeting the warmth of the candlelight, surrounding her completely from every direction. The candles were set in iron holders along the walls, low, simple holders, not decorative, not elaborate, the kind that exist purely to hold a light at the right height for a person standing in a corridor. The candles themselves were thick and cream-colored, and they burned with the steadiness that good beeswax candles have, barely a flicker, each flame a steady upright oval of warm amber light that cast the stone walls in gold and made the shadows move in that slow, hypnotic way that only candlelight achieves, the way that has been making human beings feel safe and quiet for as long as there have been human beings and fire. She stood in the entrance hall and let it receive her. That was the word that came to her. Received. Not admitted, not welcomed in the active, performative way of a hotel or a waiting room. Received in the older sense, taken in, accepted, held. The space simply opened around her and closed gently behind her, and she was inside it, and it was warm, and she was entirely welcome. A door to her left was slightly open. Through it, the cello. She had not heard it until now. Or perhaps she had heard it without registering it. The way you sometimes hear music before you know you are hearing it. your body responding to it several seconds before your mind catches up and says, "That is music. That is a cello. That is someone playing something extraordinarily beautiful in the next room." It was not a piece she recognized. Or perhaps it was not a piece at all. Not something written down. Not something that began in one key and moved through changes and arrived at a resolution. It felt more like the musical equivalent of breath. Continuous, unhurried, finding its own direction as it went. The bow moving across the strings in long, slow phrases that rose and fell and turned back on themselves without any apparent need to go anywhere in particular. She stood and listened. The cello did what a cello, played like this, always does. It reached directly into the chest and placed something there. Not an emotion, not quite, but the precondition for emotion. A kind of openness, a receptivity, a softening of whatever had been held tight. She felt it physically, in the area around her sternum, as a warmth that was not the warmth of the room, but something generated from within. The way the body responds to music that reaches it properly, when the ears are not too tired or too defended to let it through. She was not too tired. She was not defended. The walk through the evening and the mist and the woodland had taken care of that. She was standing in the warmth, listening to the cello, when she heard footsteps. They were unhurried. That was the first thing she noticed about them. A quality she was already coming to associate with this place. This unhurriedness. This absence of any urgency in how things moved and arrived. The footsteps came from deeper in the building, growing gradually louder without rushing. And then a door opened at the far end of the entrance hall, and he was there. Orend. She did not know yet that this was his name. She would learn it in a moment. But even before she knew his name, she had an impression of him that was complete and immediate. A young man, perhaps mid-20s, with the kind of face that is arranged in a way that is naturally calm, not blank, not unexpressive, but fundamentally calm, the way certain landscapes are calm, the way still water is calm. He was not particularly tall. He wore linen the color of birch bark, very pale, very simply cut. And he moved with the ease of someone who has long ago stopped rushing and has discovered that almost nothing actually requires rushing, that the world is quite happy to wait a moment, and that arrivals, when unhurried, are considerably better than arrivals that have been rushed. His eyes, when they met hers, were kind in the specific and rather rare way of people who are kind not as a professional manner or a social performance, but as a fundamental orientation. People for whom kindness is simply the default setting, the thing they return to when nothing else is requiring them. He looked at her as though she were exactly the person he had been expecting, not with the practiced warmth of hospitality training, not with the bright, performed welcome of someone whose job requires them to seem pleased. With something quieter and more genuine than that. With the simple satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for the right person to arrive and can now see that they have. "Welcome," he said. One word. But the way he said it, unhurried, without performance, as though the word contained everything it was supposed to contain and required no augmentation, made it enough. More than enough. She felt it land somewhere specific, somewhere that had been waiting to hear exactly this, and the landing of it released something small but real in her chest. "I'm Oren," he said. "I'll be looking after you this evening." A pause, not an uncomfortable one, a pause with room in it. "You've had a walk." It was not quite a question, and not quite a statement. It was the acknowledgement of someone who had seen her arrive from across a dark meadow and through an old woodland and understood, without requiring details, something true about the state she was in and the distance she had covered. "I have," she said. Her own voice sounded different to her than usual, quieter, slower, as though it too had picked up some quality of the evening in its tone. "Then you'll want to be still for a while before anything else," Oren said. And this was not a question at all. He said it the way you state a fact that both people already know. He said it with the confidence of someone who understands tiredness and knows that its first requirement is not treatment, but simply acknowledgement, the simple recognition that you have arrived, and that arriving is enough, and that what comes next can wait the length of a breath. He led her through the door to her left, and the receiving room opened around her. She stopped in the doorway. It was not large, and it was not grand, and it was nothing like the lobbies of the resorts or hotels she had occasionally visited in her life. Those high-ceilinged, marble-floored declarations of scale, designed to impress before they comfort. It was a room designed entirely for comfort, for the kind of comfort that is not luxury in the expensive sense, but luxury in the truest sense. The luxury of being exactly the right temperature, of having exactly the right amount of light, of occupying a space that has no hard edges and no unnecessary demands. The ceiling was low, low enough that the room felt contained, held, like the inside of something good. The walls were plastered in a warm off-white that caught the candlelight and gave it back as a gentle golden warmth. The floor was the same heated limestone as the entrance hall, and several rugs lay across it. Old rugs, the colors faded to those beautiful muted tones that only come with genuine age, deep reds and old golds and faded blues, the colors of things that have been richly themselves and are now content to be quietly themselves. Bookshelves along one wall held books and small plants and ceramic vessels, and a few smooth stones of the quality of something that has arrived at its current configuration, gradually and naturally, rather than been deliberately styled. The comfortable accumulation of things that belong to a place and know it. Wide chairs occupied the room in a loose arrangement, 4 of them well spaced, each one different, each one with the particular character of furniture that has been chosen for sitting in rather than for looking at. She was drawn immediately to the one nearest the window, a wide, deep chair upholstered in something the color of old ivory wool, with armrests broad enough to rest a cup on, and cushions that had been compressed by many sittings into the ideal configuration for the human body in repose. It was the chair of someone who had sat in it, and sat in it again, and returned to it repeatedly across a long and uncomplicated relationship. Oren touched the back of it gently with one hand. "Whenever you're ready," he said. She sat down. The chair received her the way the best chairs do, not as a surface she had landed on, but as something that adjusted itself to her, meeting her weight with exactly the right resistance, supporting the small of her back and the backs of her thighs with a precision that suggested either extraordinary quality of construction or the kind of long use that shapes furniture to the body over time. She felt herself settle into it with a slow exhalation that was slightly beyond her control, a breath that came out longer and more thoroughly than she had intended, as though the chair had simply taken some of what she was holding and quietly absorbed it. Oren appeared at her side with a cup. It was clay, a small, wide cup made of the same pale reddish clay as the vessels on the bookshelves, smooth but not polished. Its warmth immediately felt through her palms as she took it in both hands. The drink was pale gold in color, the steam rising from it unhurriedly, carrying an aroma she breathed in before tasting. Chamomile, unmistakably, and with it something else, something sweeter and quieter, linden perhaps, and beneath both of them, a warmth that was not quite spice and not quite herb, but something in between, something that her body recognized with an immediate and inarticulate approval. She drank, slowly. The warmth of it moved through her in a way she could trace, almost down her throat, spreading across her chest, moving outward from her center toward her limbs. It was the warmth of something that has been carefully made, something in which the proportions of ingredients have been considered and refined until they meet the body with exactly the right effect. Not medicinal, not overwrought, but gently, efficiently comforting in a way that felt as natural as the warmth of the floor beneath her feet. The cello was closer here, or perhaps the room simply carried it better. It moved through the warm air with the unhurried continuation of something that has been playing for a long time and intends to continue playing for a long time and has no particular agenda in either direction. She let it move through her. She did not listen to it the way she would have listened to music in her ordinary life, with attention, with evaluation, with the slight critical engagement of someone who has opinions about music. She let it simply arrive, the way you let warmth arrive, without engaging it, only receiving it. Her eyes moved slowly around the room. The candles, the books, the faded rugs, the smooth stones on the shelves, the wisteria at the window, its yellowed October leaves just visible against the dark glass, a few of the fireflies visible beyond them, floating at their patient, unhurried height. She was somewhere extraordinary, she thought. She was somewhere that she suspected had been here for a very long time, waiting with the patience of old things for the people who needed it to find it. It was not a place that advertised itself. It was not a place that made itself easy to find. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the effort of finding it, the walk through the evening and the mist and the dark of the old woodland, was itself part of what it offered. Perhaps you had to arrive on foot and without a phone and without any certainty about what you were walking toward, and in doing so, leave behind the parts of yourself that could not make that journey. She finished the cup. Oren appeared, as though he had simply been waiting for the moment, and took it gently from her hands. "Everything here is for your rest," he said. He said it quietly, almost conversationally, as though reminding her of something she already knew. "There is nothing you need to do tonight except be." She looked up at him. His face was calm and unhurried and entirely sincere. "Nothing," she said. "Nothing," he confirmed, a pause. "How does that sound?" She considered it for a moment, the actual lived experience of it, the real and unfamiliar prospect of an evening with no task at its center, no output required, no performance of any kind. An evening whose only content was her own rest and comfort, and the simple, undemanding continuation of her own existence in a warm and beautiful place. "Terrifying," she said. And then, before he could respond, "And absolutely wonderful." Oren smiled. It was a small smile, appropriate to the room and the evening, not too large. "Then we're in the right place," he said. He stepped back, and the cello played on, and the candles held their steady amber light, and the heated floor sent its warmth upward through the rugs and into her feet, and the last of what she had been carrying when she had stood at her kitchen sink 3 hours ago. The gray and particular tiredness, the accumulated weight of many full days, settled very slowly, like sediment in still water, to the bottom. She was here. She was held. She was, for the first time in a long time, nowhere else. The night ahead was long and good, and full of things she did not yet know. Warm water and cedar, herbs and moonlight, the hands of someone skilled and quiet, a garden where flowers bloomed in the dark, all of it waiting for her, prepared and patient in the rooms and spaces of the hidden forest spa that breathed around her like something alive, something deeply content to have her in it. She sat in the ivory chair, she breathed, and she let the evening begin. The receiving room. Time moved differently here. She had noticed it first on the walk. The way the meadow had felt wider than its actual dimensions. The way the woodland had seemed to hold her inside a stretch of minutes that did not behave like ordinary minutes. But here, inside the warm stone walls of the receiving room, the phenomenon was more pronounced and more deliberate, as though the room itself had been designed with the specific intention of releasing its occupants from time's usual governance. There was no clock. She had already established this with a slow, unhurried survey of the room from her chair, the bookshelves, the walls, the surfaces near the candles. No clock anywhere. Not hidden, not overlooked. Simply absent in the way that something is absent when it has been thoughtfully excluded rather than merely forgotten. She found she did not miss it. This was surprising to her. She was a person who had always known what time it was, not obsessively, not anxiously, but as a background fact, a constant low-level orientation that her mind maintained without effort, the way it maintained awareness of temperature or light. She checked the time the way she breathed, automatically, continuously, without conscious decision. The time was always relevant. The time was always telling her something about where she was in the structure of a day. How much had been accomplished? How much remained? What was coming next? And how much space existed before it arrived? Here, without a clock, without a phone, without any of the devices that ordinarily reported the time to her with such relentless efficiency, she had expected to feel unmoored. She had expected the low anxiety of not knowing, that particular restlessness that surfaces when the frameworks we depend on for orientation are temporarily removed. But she felt none of that. She felt instead something she could only describe as horizontal, as though time, usually experienced as a vertical column she was climbing, rung by rung, hour by hour, upward towards some implied summit of sufficient productivity, had here become a flat and open plain, extending in all directions without gradient or urgency, through which she could move as slowly as she liked, or not move at all. She was not moving at all. She was sitting in the ivory wool chair, and she had been sitting in it for she did not know how long. Long enough for the warmth of the room to have worked its way fully through her. Long enough for the cello to have played through several of its long, wandering phrases. Long enough for her shoulders to have descended to a position she was not sure they had occupied since early summer. Long enough, in other words, for something that had been held to have let go. The candles had burned perhaps a centimeter lower. That was the only clock in the room, and she observed it without calculation. simply as a fact about candles, about wax and flame, and the patient, honest way that fire consumes things and gives light in return. Oren moved through the room with the particular quality of presence that she had noticed when he first appeared, and that she continued to find remarkable. The quality of being entirely there without being intrusive. He replenished the candles before they guttered, added a small log to the iron stove set into the far wall. She had noticed the stove earlier, its glass front glowing with the soft orange pulse of banked coals, and set things on the low table near her chair with a quietness that was not merely the quietness of someone trying not to disturb, but the quietness of someone for whom quiet was a natural condition, a settled choice rather than an effort maintained. She watched him for a moment with the half-focused gaze of genuine relaxation, the gaze you have when your eyes are open but not seeking anything, simply receiving what is in front of them. He moved the way the room felt, unhurried, purposeful, without being driven, warm. She thought about what it would mean to move through the world with that quality, consistently, not as a performance of ease, not as the performed tranquility of someone who has learned to seem calm, but as the genuine article, the real orientation of a person who has settled some internal argument and come out the other side into a lasting quietness. She thought it must require something, some decision or series of decisions, or perhaps a sustained practice, the accumulation of many small choices made in the direction of stillness rather than speed. Or perhaps some people simply arrived in the world that way. She turned back to the room. The bookshelves drew her attention again, as bookshelves always did. She was an editor. She was constitutionally incapable of ignoring a shelf of books for long, the way a musician cannot be in a room with a piano and remain entirely indifferent to it. From her chair, she could read the spines of the nearest ones, though the candlelight made it slightly effortful. They were not organized by any system she could immediately identify. They were not sorted by subject or by author, or by the color of their spines in the way of certain aggressively styled interiors. They had the arrangement of books that have been read and replaced, and moved and reread, and lent, and returned, and gradually settled into their positions through the organic process of actual use, some upright, some at angles, a few lying flat with others stacked on top. The spines she could make out were varied. Some poetry, she thought, and what looked like natural history, and a few novels with the faded, slightly battered look of books that have been read multiple times by people who loved them. There was something deeply consoling about a shelf of loved books. She thought about her own shelves at home, the ones in her study that held the manuscripts she was working on, organized precisely and accessibly in the way of tools that need to be found quickly. And the other shelves, the personal ones in her sitting room, that she realized now she had not browsed in some time, had not sat with, had not allowed to catch her eye and pull her into the kind of unplanned, leisurely reading that is one of the genuine pleasures of having books in a space where you sit still. She had been too busy or too tired in the wrong kind of way. The kind of tired that reaches for a screen rather than a book, that wants the passive reception of something served rather than the gentle activity of choosing and opening and entering. She made a small and private note to herself, the kind that does not require writing down. When she returned, she would sit with her own shelves again. She would let a book catch her eye. She would read for no reason except the reading. Oren appeared at her side with something new. Not a cup this time. A small wooden board set on the low table beside her, which held several things arranged with the same unhurried care as everything else in this place. A small pot of honey, dark and fragrant, with a wooden dipper resting across its rim. A few pieces of dark bread, dense and slightly warm, the kind made with whole grains and time and genuine attention. 3 small rounds of something pale and soft. Cheese, she thought, though it smelled more herbal than most cheeses she knew. Faintly of thyme, and something else she could not identify. A cluster of dried figs, their skin crinkled and dark, and a sprig of fresh rosemary laid across one corner of the board, which was doing nothing practical except being fragrant, which was enough. You didn't eat much today, Oren said. It was not a question, and she did not ask how he knew. It felt, in this place, like the kind of thing that was simply known. She looked at the board and felt hunger surface, not the sharp, demanding hunger of someone who has forgotten to eat, but the gentle, specific hunger of someone whose body has recognized something it needs and is asking for it with appropriate but genuine insistence. She had, in fact, eaten only partially today, lunch at her desk, as she had noted to herself earlier, which meant she had eaten while also doing something else, which meant she had not really eaten in the full sense, had not tasted it or attended to it, or given it the simple respect of her presence. She took a piece of bread and spread honey on it with the wooden dipper. The honey was thick and moved slowly, reluctantly, stretching in a long amber thread before it gathered itself onto the bread's dark surface. It smelled of something wildflower, complicated, varied. The smell of honey made from the nectar of many different plants, rather than the single-note sweetness of commercially produced varieties. She took a bite. She paused with it in her mouth for a moment, attending to it fully in a way she almost never attended to food anymore. It was extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the sense of technically impressive. Extraordinary in the sense of completely real. The bread was dense and slightly bitter, with the good bitterness of whole grains, and the honey was complex and sweet, and carried underneath its sweetness a faint trace of something resinous and herbal. And together, they were exactly what her body had been needing, not in the generic sense of sustenance, but in the specific, unambiguous sense of exactly this, exactly now. She chewed slowly. She tasted it. She could not remember the last time she had tasted food. She could remember eating. She had eaten every day, obviously. She had consumed calories and nutrients and meals at roughly appropriate intervals, but tasting the actual full sensory engagement with what was in her mouth, the attending to flavor and texture and temperature as ends in themselves, rather than as background information, while her attention was occupied elsewhere. That was something she had been doing rarely. She realized now, for quite some time. She ate slowly and deliberately, and with her full attention, and each thing on the small wooden board gave itself to her completely, because she was actually there to receive it. The cheese was soft and herbal and faintly sharp. The figs were dense and sweet and darkly fragrant. The bread, taken twice more with honey, was deeply satisfying in the way that simple things made well are satisfying, without complication, without performance, with only the honest goodness of good ingredients and care. When she had finished, she sat back in the chair and felt the food settle in her, warmth added to warmth, substance to substance, the body's quiet appreciation of having been genuinely fed. The cello continued. She had been listening to it in her peripheral way throughout. But now, fed and warm and fully in the chair, she let it come forward in her attention, gave it the center of her awareness rather than the edges. She listened to it properly. It was a single instrument. She was sure of that, not a recording, not a piece with accompaniment, but a single cello played by a single person somewhere in this building, close enough that the acoustic quality of the sound was fully present. The weight of the bow, the breath of the resonating body of the instrument, the very slight imperfections that live performances have and recordings cannot replicate. Those imperceptible human hesitations and pressures that tell you there is a person behind the sound rather than a mechanism. The playing was exceptional, not in the virtuosic sense of rapid and technically demanding passages, but in the more demanding and less obvious sense of depth. The player had something to say and knew how to say it with a bow and 4 strings, and what they were saying was neither sad nor happy, but something larger than both. Something about continuance, about the way things persist, about the low and uninterrupted thread of being that runs beneath the surface noise of any life. She felt tears come to her eyes, not dramatically, not the wet, breaching tears of strong emotion, but the quiet, brimming kind that appear when something reaches you properly, when some combination of music and warmth and food and rest, and the particular softened state of a person who has been walked through an evening into a place of genuine care creates a moment of such complete and unexpected okayness that the body marks it with the only response it has for things that are too real for ordinary expression. She let them come, and she let them go. She did not wipe them away quickly or feel embarrassed by them. There was no one watching. There was only the room and the candles and the cello and the stove with its patient orange glow. She thought about what the tears were for. Not grief, she was not grieving. Not relief in the simplest sense. It was not that she had been frightened and was now safe. It was something more like recognition. The recognition of being in the precise place she needed to be, in the precise state she needed to be in, at the precise moment when the need was real enough to be felt clearly. The sensation of having been seen, not by any specific person, not necessarily, but by something, by the evening, by the forest, by the mysterious and deliberate goodness that had sent an ivory envelope to her doorstep and led her here through the dark. She had been seen, and she had been sent somewhere that could hold what she was carrying and give her back to herself. She breathed in, she breathed out. The cello played its long, low phrases. After a while, she could not have said how long. She became aware of other things in the room beyond the music and the candles. Small details that had been present all along, but that she was only now arriving at with sufficient attention to register properly. The smell of the room, which had layers she was still finding. The beeswax and cedar she had identified on entering, and beneath them, something she thought might be sandalwood from a small dish near the stove, and threading through everything a very faint, clean greenness. The smell, she thought, of the moss outside, carried in on her clothes and her hair, and the air that had entered with her when she came through the door, and that had chosen to remain. She was carrying the outside in with her. Fragments of the meadow and the woodland were still present on her, and would be for a while the particular smell of old trees, of leaf fall, of water in the dark. She thought about this and found it companionable rather than uncomfortable. The outside had given her something tonight. She was glad to have some of it still with her inside the warm room. She noticed the plants. She had registered the bookshelves earlier, but not attended closely to the plants. Several of them on the lower shelves, and on the wide stone sill of the room's single window, and one in a terracotta pot in the room's corner that was larger than the others, its dark leaves catching the candlelight with a waxy gleam. She could not identify all of them. An aloe, she was fairly sure, in a small pot near the stove, its thick gray-green leaves fanning upward with their characteristic succulent patience. Something trailing from one of the higher shelves, its leaves small and numerous and very dark, and in the window several plants she associated with herbs and warmth. What looked like rosemary in a small pot, and something with pale gray-green leaves she thought might be sage, and one she did not know at all, with very small rounded leaves and a smell that reached her from across the room. Faint, complex, a little resinous. Something her nose found completely right without being able to name. Living things in a warm room. She had plants at home, a few on the kitchen windowsill and on the bookshelf in her study. But she had not, she realized, been paying them much attention lately. She had been watering them adequately, keeping them alive in the basic sense. But plants, like most living things, respond to attention. They respond to being looked at, to being considered, to the quality of care that notices them as particular living things rather than merely as objects to be maintained. She made another small private note. The stove pulsed gently, orange and gold. A log settled within it with a soft interior sound. Not a crack, not a pop, but a settling, a compression. The sound of something giving itself over to fire gradually and without resistance. She thought about her body. This was something she rarely did in a deliberate way. Thought about her body as a distinct entity with its own needs and communications, separate from the mind that was always directing and organizing and producing. She was aware, as she sat in the warm chair, of every part of herself in a way that was unusual and rather wonderful. The heaviness of her limbs, which was not the heaviness of exhaustion, but the heaviness of genuine relaxation muscles that had released their holding, that were no longer maintaining any performance, that had simply let gravity be in charge for a while. The slight warmth in her cheeks from the stove and the spiced drink. The fullness in her stomach, comfortable and settled. The places along her spine where the chair's cushions met it and held it exactly right. Her body was speaking to her clearly and simply in a language she had not been listening to carefully enough. Not in complaint. It was not telling her that anything was wrong in this moment. It was telling her that this was right. That this warmth and this stillness and this absence of demand were what it had been needing, and that it recognized the rightness of them with a deep and uncomplicated gratitude. She owed her body more of this, she thought. Not as a luxury, not as a reward for sufficient productivity, simply as the basic requirement of a living thing that has been working hard for a long time and deserves, at intervals, to simply exist without task. Oren appeared in the doorway. He had the quality of someone who could appear in a doorway without it feeling like an intrusion, without the slight disturbance to the air that most arrivals create, the micro-adjustment of attention and posture that happens when another person enters a space you have been occupying alone. He was simply there, as the candles were simply there, as the music was simply there. Whenever you feel ready, he said, I can take you through. she did not ask through to wear. She did not feel the need. She understood in the way that you understand things in certain states of deep relaxation, not through analysis, but through a kind of whole-body knowing that whatever came next had been prepared for her with the same care and consideration as everything that had preceded it, that she was in capable, gentle hands, that the only thing asked of her was the willingness to continue, to move from this warmth into the next warmth, from this gift into the next one. She sat for one more moment in the ivory chair. She looked around the room, the candles with their centimeter lower, the bookshelves with their loved books, the stove with its orange heart, the plants in the window, the small, empty wooden board on the table beside her. She let the cello have one more long phrase. Then she put her hands on the armrests and stood. Her body rose slowly, and the warmth of the floor came up through her shoes and into her feet, and the room held her in its amber light for a moment before she turned toward the door, toward Oren's calm and waiting face, toward whatever the next room of the evening held. She was not tired in the gray way anymore. She was warm and fed and soft in the muscles, and her mind had quieted to a register she had not heard it at in a very long time. Low and unhurried, like the cello, like the stream in the dark woodland, like the breathing of the old trees. She was ready. She did not know for what. She was ready anyway. Behind her, as she left the room, the candles went on burning. The cello went on playing. The stove pulsed its patient orange. And the receiving room, which had held her for an uncounted and unhurried hour, settled back into its own quiet, content with what it had done, the small and essential work of receiving a person who had needed receiving, and giving them, before anything else, simply the gift of arriving. The cedar sauna, the corridor was narrow and warm and smelled of the earth, not unpleasantly, not the damp, dark smell of cellars, or the closed mustiness of spaces that have been shut too long. This was the earth smell of something living and rooted, of wood and stone, and the deep vegetable patience of materials that were once growing things and have retained, in their transformation into walls and floors and ceilings, some memory of what they were. The corridor ran toward the back of the building with a gentle curve that prevented you from seeing its end from its beginning. And this, she thought, was deliberate. The way the whole building seemed deliberate, each element chosen not for the impression it made, but for the effect it created in the person moving through it. She walked behind Oren and attended to the details as they passed. The floor here was different from the entrance hall, and the receiving room, not limestone, but wide planks of dark wood, worn smooth by years of bare feet and soft shoes, the grain of them visible in long, beautiful striations that caught the light of the small oil lamps set into the wall at intervals. The lamps were old, the kind that burn actual oil, with a small adjustable wick, and that produce a flame quite different from a candle's, steadier, slightly warmer in color, less susceptible to the movement of air. Each one was enclosed in a small glass globe that turned its light amber and soft, and together they lined the corridor like a series of small warm planets, each one illuminating its small territory of wall and floor, the spaces between them dim but not dark. She ran her fingers along the wall as she walked. The plaster was cool and slightly rough, not the perfect smoothness of modern construction, but the honest unevenness of something done by hand, by someone who knew that a wall should be solid and true, and did not feel the need to sand it to a commercial uniformity. Under her fingertips, it felt like the wall of an old farmhouse, or a church, or a building whose makers had understood that the people using it would sometimes touch the walls, and had made them worth touching. Orin walked without speaking, and she was grateful for the silence. She had noticed, since arriving here, that the silences were not awkward. They did not require filling. They did not carry the slight social pressure of silences between people who do not know each other well and feel the obligation to demonstrate ease through the production of words. These silences were simply what they were, the appropriate medium for this place and this evening. Conversation would have introduced a different kind of attention, outward-facing, socially oriented, requiring the part of her that managed presentation and response. The silence allowed her to remain inside herself, attending to what she was feeling rather than what she was communicating. She was feeling a great deal, in the quiet way of a person whose outer layers have been progressively, gently stripped back over the course of an evening, until something real and unguarded is close to the surface. The corridor curved and then ended at a door. It was a smaller door than the others she had passed through tonight, lower, narrower, with a thick iron handle worn to brightness at its grip. The wood of it was the same pale cedar she would discover inside, and even here, before she had opened it, the scent was present. Faint, warm, resinous. The smell of cedar in a small enclosed space, gently heated. A smell that is at once aromatic and clean and deeply, specifically itself, unlike anything else. She had smelled it before, in small wooden boxes and cedar-lined closets, but never like this, never as a presence in the air rather than a trace on a surface, never as the dominant fact of a room. Orin opened the door. The warmth came first. Before she saw anything, before her eyes adjusted from the corridor's amber dimness to the interior of the room, the warmth arrived, met her at the threshold, and pressed itself against her with the gentle insistence of something that has been waiting in a small space and is glad of the opening. It was not hot in the way that surprises, not the wall of fierce heat you encounter opening an oven door, not the aggressive, almost hostile heat of certain steam rooms she had been in briefly years ago and found overwhelming. This was different. This was warm in the way that the word warm, properly used, implies. A warmth that is on your side, that arrives with benevolent intent, that does not overwhelm, but envelops. She stepped inside. The room was small, perhaps 8 feet across, perhaps 10 feet long, intimate in scale, built for 1 or 2 people at most, not designed for groups or efficiency, or any purpose beyond the single, ancient, entirely sufficient purpose of sitting in warmth, and letting the warmth do what it knows how to do. The ceiling was low. She could have raised her arm and touched it without fully extending. The walls were cedar. The ceiling was cedar. The floor was cedar, laid in wide planks. The benches that ran along 2 sides of the room were cedar, wide, flat, made of the same planks, smooth from use, the edges slightly rounded by the accumulated friction of people sitting down and standing up and sitting down again over many years, and the cedar was fragrant, powerfully, beautifully, almost overwhelmingly fragrant in the first moment of entry, before the senses adjusted and the fragrance became something she was inside rather than something striking her from outside. The smell of cedar in genuine heat is not the modest scent of a cedar-lined drawer. It is the smell of the essential oils in the wood being gently released by warmth, rising from the grain of every surface, filling the air with something that smells simultaneously of forests and of something older than forests, something that predates human categories and goes directly to some part of the nervous system that responds without processing. She breathed it in and breathed it in again. The source of the heat was a small iron stove in the corner, older even than the one in the receiving room, its surface dark and slightly rough with long use, radiating a consistent and profound warmth that she could feel on her face and the backs of her hands before she was anywhere near it. Oren had placed a wooden pail of water and a long-handled ladle on the floor beside it, and on the top of the stove, a flat stone held several things she leaned slightly closer to identify. Small bundles of dried eucalyptus and pine needles, their oils already beginning to release in the ambient heat, adding to the cedar their own sharp, clean green notes. A small dish of something granular and pale, salt, perhaps, or a salt herb mixture that smelled of the sea and rosemary together. Single lamp, set into the wall high in one corner, cast the room in amber. It was the color of the inside of the room that most arrested her, a warm gold amber that suffused everything, given by the cedar walls that had absorbed years of warmth and light, and were giving it back now as a collective radiance, as though every plank and board in the room was participating together in the production of this particular quality of light. You could not look at a single source of it. It came from everywhere. It was the room itself that was luminous. She sat on the lower bench. The cedar under her was warm in a way that surprised her, though it should not have. She had known the bench would be warm, but knowing and feeling are different, and the feeling of warm wood under her was unexpectedly intimate, unexpectedly kind. It was the temperature of something living, not hot enough to be uncomfortable, but warm enough that the distinction between the temperature of the bench and the temperature of her own body was narrow. The way the distinction between the temperature of the air and the temperature of your skin is narrow when the air is exactly right. She felt it through the fabric of her clothes and knew without thinking that the warmth would work its way through quickly into the muscles of the backs of her thighs, into the base of her spine. Oren spoke from the doorway. "I'll leave you," he said, with the simple directness of someone who understands when a person needs to be alone. "Take as long as you wish. The water is for the stove, a ladle at a time, whenever you want more steam. The eucalyptus bundles can go on the stone." A pause. "There's nothing to do in here except be warm." She looked at him. "You say that a lot," she said. "There's nothing to do." "It needs saying a lot," he said. And then, with the small, unhurried smile that suited him, he pulled the door closed behind him. She was alone. The cedar room held her in its warmth, and its fragrance, and its amber light, and she sat on the lower bench with her hands resting loosely in her lap, and allowed herself to be alone with it. There is a difference, she thought, between being alone and being lonely. She was alone, and she was not in the slightest lonely. She was alone in the way that you are alone in a very good dream. Completely, pleasantly, entirely sufficient to herself, contained within an experience that required no witness and no company to be exactly what it was. The heat built. It built gradually, the way it does in a properly made sauna, not suddenly or aggressively, not in a way that demands response or adjustment, but in the slow, insistent way of something that knows exactly where it is going and is in no hurry to get there. She felt it first across her shoulders, the warmth arriving there specifically, as though it had identified in advance the place most in need of attention and had gone there first. The tension she had been carrying between her shoulder blades, that deep, knotted, long-established tension that had its own geography, its own history, its own particular way of making itself known as a dull and persistent pressure, felt the heat arrive and responded, not immediately, not with the sudden dramatic release of something cinematically transformed. It was slower than that, and more honest than that. The heat laid itself against the tight muscles, the way you lay a warm cloth against a bruise, not curring, not fixing, beginning the long and patient conversation between warmth and tension, between what has been held and what is possible if holding is allowed to soften. She felt the first small giving, not a release, but a loosening, the way a knot begins to give before it comes undone. When the first few outer threads have been gently persuaded apart, she let out a long breath. It was the kind of breath you do not plan. It came from somewhere she was not monitoring, which meant it came from somewhere genuine, somewhere below the level of management and presentation, from the body's own assessment of what it needed and what it was receiving. It went on longer than she expected, past the ordinary length of an exhale, into the space beyond it, all the way to the absolute bottom of her lungs. And when it finally ended, she sat in the momentary emptiness of having completely breathed out and felt, in that empty moment, perfectly simple. Then she breathed in again, and the cedar came in with the air, and the eucalyptus, and the warm, resinous richness of the room. And she brought all of it into her body and held it there for a breath's worth of time before releasing it. And the release was another long, slow unwinding, another small giving of something held. She picked up the ladle and poured a measure of water onto the stove. The sound it made was extraordinary. That hiss and rush of water meeting extreme heat, the immediate explosive conversion to steam, the sound of something solid becoming something diffuse and enveloping. The steam rose instantly, spreading across the ceiling, and then descending slowly through the room in a warm, invisible wave that she felt arrive at her face and her arms as a new dimension of warmth, moisture, more immediate, more penetrating than the dry warmth of the air. She closed her eyes. With her eyes closed, the room became entirely sensation, the warmth on her face and her hands, the cedar pressing itself into her awareness through every breath. The sound she had not realized, until she closed her eyes, how rich the sound of the room was. The small adjustments of the wood as it expanded gently with heat, the whisper of the steam settling, the distant sound of the building itself, which had its own quiet language of settling and breathing that she had been too visually occupied to hear before now, and her own heartbeat, which she could feel slow and steady and exactly right, the heart of someone who is warm and safe and has stopped running. She sat in it. She simply sat in it. Time here was even less relevant than it had been in the receiving room. In the receiving room, she had still been arriving, still in the process of letting the evening accumulate its effect, still carrying some residual orientation toward the ordinary progress of minutes and hours. Here, in the cedar room with its warmth and its fragrance and its complete privacy, she had fully arrived somewhere outside the reach of clocks. She was not waiting for anything. She was not building toward anything. She was not midway between 2 points on a journey with a destination. She was in the destination. She added another ladle of water, and this time, on impulse, took one of the eucalyptus bundles from the flat stone and held it near the rising steam. The eucalyptus opened immediately, the essential oils in the leaves responding to the warmth with an enthusiasm that produced, in seconds, a wave of scent so clear and sharp and clean that it felt less like smelling something and more like being washed from the inside. The eucalyptus smell reached all the way to the back of her sinuses and the top of her lungs, going places that smell almost never reaches, cleaning and opening as it went. And the effect on her breathing was immediate and profound. Her airways opened. Her lungs expanded to their full capacity, filling completely in a way she did not normally achieve without effort. She breathed in eucalyptus and cedar and pine and warmth and steam and the deep, honest smell of heated wood, and she felt her chest expand with it. And the expansion had a quality she could only describe as joy. Not the excited, outward-directed joy of pleasant events, but the quiet, interior joy of the body doing what it was designed to do, and doing it completely. Every system functioning at the ease and capacity it was built for. She put the bundle down and sat with her hands open in her lap, palms upward. Gesture was not deliberate. She noticed it after she had done it. Her hands, which had been loosely closed, had turned themselves palm up in that position that the human body takes when it is receiving something, when it has stopped defending and stopped carrying and is simply open. The position of surrender in the best sense of the word, not defeat, but the voluntary lowering of the arms that have been holding too much for too long, the simple physical declaration: I am not carrying anything right now. I am here. I am open. She thought about her life. Not anxiously, not with the reviewing, evaluating, slightly worrying quality that thinking about her life usually had when she did it in her ordinary state. She thought about it from here, from inside the cedar warmth, with the eucalyptus still fresh in her lungs and her shoulders 2 centimeters lower than their customary position. She thought about it the way you look at a landscape from a high place, with distance, with something that is not detachment, but perspective, the ability to see the whole shape rather than only the immediate path underfoot. It was a good life. She could see that clearly from here in a way she could not always see it from inside it. It was a life built on things that were real work, that mattered, quiet pleasures, relationships with people who were genuine. It was a life that had grown organically and without drama into something that fit her, the way clothes that are worn often enough eventually conform to the body's particular geography and become comfortable in a way that new things never are. It was also a life that had been running lately on reserves rather than resources. She could see that too, clearly and without self-pity, as one of the facts of the landscape. She had been drawing on something that needed replenishing, and the replenishment had been insufficient, not because the means were unavailable, but because she had not made space for it, had not treated it as a requirement, had not understood. Until this evening, until this cedar room, until the warmth currently working its patient way through the accumulated tightness in her muscles. That rest is not optional for a person who does real work and feels things genuinely, that the reservoir has a level below which it cannot function, and that maintaining it above that level is not self-indulgence, but simple, necessary stewardship. She would do better at this. Not perfectly. She was not under any illusion that a single extraordinary evening in a hidden forest spa would permanently transform her relationship with rest. She was a realist. She knew that the ordinary life she returned to would re-exert its gravity, that the mornings would be full again, that the lists would regenerate themselves. But she would know this now, would have this in her body as a physical memory of what it felt like to be truly rested, truly held, truly cared for in the most essential sense. And that memory would be a reference point, a return address, something to navigate back toward when the drift had gone on long enough. She ladled more water onto the stove. The hiss and the steam and the warmth and the cedar and the eucalyptus. She let her head rest back against the warm cedar wall behind her. The wood was smooth there, worn to a particular softness at head height, which meant she was not the first person to sit on this bench and rest her head back against this particular plank. And there was something companionable about this, the anonymous company of all the people who had sat in this room before her, who had come here tired or depleted, or simply in need of what heat and cedar and honest darkness can provide, and had sat on this same bench and felt this same warmth and breathed this same fragrant air and left lighter than they arrived. She closed her eyes again. The world outside the desk, the manuscripts, the emails, the small accumulation of undone things was very far away. Not gone, not forgotten, not denied. Simply at the correct distance for now, which was a long way away, held in a space that was not here and not now, patient enough to remain exactly where it was until she returned to it, which she would, but not yet. Not tonight. Tonight there was only cedar and warmth, and the slow, patient, wholly sufficient conversation between heat and a body that had needed heat for a long time and was finally, completely, gratefully receiving it. Her breath came in, her breath went out. The cedar held her, the warmth held her, the evening held her, and very slowly, like a door left open to a night that is warmer than expected, the last of the day's residue left her, not dramatically, not with announcement, simply drifting away in the steam, dissolving into the amber air of the cedar room, dispersing into the warmth and the darkness, and the fragrance until it was simply gone. And what remained was her, only her, without addition or accumulation, breathing cedar and feeling warm and being. For this one long and unhurried hour, entirely and simply herself, the stove glowed. The lamp burned its steady amber. The cedar walls exhaled their patient fragrance into the warm and quiet dark. And she sat in the center of it, all open-palmed, loose-shouldered, breathing slowly, held in the oldest, simplest, most human comfort there is: warmth and enclosure, and the knowledge, felt in the body before it is known in the mind, that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The moonlit pool. She did not know how long she had been in the cedar room. Long enough that when Orin opened the door, gently, with a single quiet knock preceding it, the knock of someone who respects the privacy of a person in the middle of something important. The cooler air of the corridor reached her face like a kind of greeting, a reminder that the world beyond the warmth still existed and was waiting with patience and without pressure for her to return to it. The contrast was remarkable. The rush of cooler air against her warm skin was not unpleasant, but clarifying, the way a sip of cold water is clarifying in the middle of something warm. It brought her back to her edges. It reminded her of the specific dimensions of her own body, which the deep warmth of the sauna had gradually dissolved into generality, into the larger warmth of the room itself, so that she had stopped being quite sure where she ended and the cedar began. She stood slowly. Her body felt different. There was no other way to put it, and she did not try to find a more sophisticated description. It simply felt different, not dramatically transformed, not as though something extraordinary had been done to it, but as though the several layers of unnecessary holding had been quietly, systematically removed. The way you peel an onion without tears when you know what you're doing, layer by careful layer, until you reach the real thing underneath. Her shoulders were lower. Her neck moved freely in a way it had not moved freely in weeks. The backs of her thighs, which had been carrying a particular tightness, she had attributed to too much sitting and not enough attention, had been worked on by the warmth until they were simply warm muscle, honest and loose and willing. She was a different density than she had been an hour ago. Orin handed her a towel as she emerged into the corridor. Not the large, aggressive kind of towel designed for brisk rubbing, but a softer one, wide and generously sized. The kind you can wrap around yourself and simply stand in for a moment while the warmth of your body does the drying on its own schedule. It was the color of unbleached linen, warm from having been stored near the stove, and it smelled of cedar and something clean she could not specifically name. A laundry smell that had been made from things that actually grew, herbs and sun, rather than chemicals and manufacturing processes. She wrapped it around her shoulders, The pool is outside, Orrin said. He said it quietly, as he said everything, with the particular quality of speaking that treats silence as the default state and sound as something introduced into it with care. Through the door at the end. Take your time. Is it cold? She asked. He smiled at this, a fuller smile than the small ones he had offered earlier, a smile that contained genuine warmth and something that might have been a very quiet fondness for the question. It is warm, he said. Everything tonight is warm. She walked to the end of the corridor. The door there was different from the others, wider, and made not of the dark interior timber, but of something paler and more weathered. A wood that had clearly been exposed to outdoor conditions for a long time, and had responded by becoming more beautiful, more nuanced in its coloring, developing the complex pale gray-silver gold of wood that has known sun and rain and frost and the passage of many seasons without any of it being a problem. The iron hardware was green with age in the way that iron outdoors eventually becomes, and the handle was a simple bar, worn to smoothness at the grip, fitted perfectly to the human hand in the way of things that have been used in exactly the right way for a very long time. She put her hand to it and paused. Through the door, she could feel it before she opened it. A change in the quality of the air, a slight shift in the temperature, the sense of outdoor space pressing against the other side of the wood. She could feel, faintly, the coolness of the night, and underneath the coolness, threaded through it, the distinctive quality of warm water in cool air. That particular humidity, that specific and unmistakable warmth within coolness that thermal pools produce. The contrast of temperatures that makes the skin electric with the pleasurable confusion of receiving both at once. She opened the door. The night opened around her. She had been inside for, she did not know how long. Long enough that she had forgotten the specific quality of being outdoors. The way the sky is above you, and the ground is below you, and the air moves rather than stays still. And the entire world is larger than any room, however beautiful the room. She stepped through the door, and the night received her, and the first thing she did was look up. The stars were extraordinary. She had seen them earlier on the walk through the woodland, had stood beneath the gap in the canopy, and looked up with the newly washed eyes of someone who had been spending too much time looking at screens and close surfaces, and found them sharp and numerous and deeply beautiful. But here, outside the building, in the clearing that was entirely open to the sky above, they were even more present. The clearing had been chosen well, or had formed well, or both. And the result was an unobstructed oval of night sky, framed by the dark, irregular edges of the surrounding trees. A frame that made the sky within it feel intimate rather than overwhelming. contained enough to be truly looked at rather than merely glanced at. The moon was full. She had not expected the moon to be full. Or perhaps she had known it in the abstract sense of knowing what phase the moon was in when she had last thought about it, which was some time ago, but had not carried it forward into this evening as a live piece of information. Here it was then, full and high, and brilliant in a way that full moons in October are brilliant. Not the high white brilliance of a summer moon, but something cooler and more amber, more golden at its edges, a light that seemed to come from within the moon itself rather than merely reflected from some external source. It lit the clearing completely. Not the amber gold warmth of the candles inside, but a cooler, more liquid light, silver white, the light that things have in dreams, the light that erases ordinary colors and replaces them with its own luminous gray blues and silver whites and deep shadows. The moss on the ground was silver. The pale stone of the building behind her was the color of old bone. The steam that rose from the pool ahead of her, she could see it now, rising in slow columns that the moonlight made visible and beautiful, was silver white, the purest white, moving upward into the cool air with a patience and a beauty that made her stop walking for a moment and simply watch it. The pool was cradled. That was the first word she found for it, and she kept it because it was the right one. It had not been cut into the ground or built up from a flat surface. It occupied a natural depression in the clearing's floor, a hollow in the earth that might have been formed by anything, by the roots of a tree long gone, by the slow accumulation of rainwater over centuries, gradually softening the same place in the ground until a bowl formed, by something geological she did not know enough to name. Whatever its origin, it had been worked with rather than against. Lined with smooth, dark stone set so carefully into the natural shape that the border between what was placed and what was natural was impossible to find. The pale stones shaped and fitted to follow every curve of the depression with such fidelity that the whole thing looked grown rather than built. The boulders, several large boulders, smooth, rounded, ancient things, covered on their northern faces with the pale lichen she had noticed on the trees during the walk. Their surfaces, a complex map of gray and white and pale green, had been incorporated into the pool's surround. They were not decorative, or not only decorative. They were structural, leaning into the pool's edge at various points, providing ledges and seats and surfaces to rest against, and holding within their mass the warmth of the water that lapped continuously against them, so that their surfaces, which should have been cool in the October night, were instead pleasantly warm, warmed by the water from below, by the day's residual heat from within, by the particular thermal memory that large stones have when they have been in contact with warm water for for a long time. The water was the color of dark jade. She stood at the pool's edge and looked down into it. The moonlight lay on the surface in a broad, irregular path. The classic, undeniable moon path. The light that has always made people stop what they were doing and look at water at night. And through this path she could see, very slightly, into the depth of the pool, which was not great. Perhaps 4 feet at its deepest point, enough to be submerged to the shoulders when standing, enough to float in fully. The bottom was the same dark stone as the surround, and the water was clear in the way that naturally mineral water is clear. Not the perfect transparency of chemically treated water, but a living clarity, slightly tinted by whatever was dissolved in it, jade green, the color of something geological and old and entirely real. Steam moved continuously from the surface. She watched it for a moment, the way it rose from the water and then spread outward and upward, each column dispersing gradually into the cool air above, the moonlight catching it and rendering it briefly visible before it became too diffuse to see. It was the visible evidence of the water's warmth, the warmth announcing itself into the cool night air, and watching it produced in her a specific and particular desire, the desire to be inside the warmth, to have the warmth all around her, rather than only arriving at her face and hands. As she stood at the edge looking in, she removed her shoes. She set them to one side of a flat rock that had been placed near the pool's edge for exactly this purpose. A wide, flat stone at a convenient height, its surface also warm, that served as a kind of antechamber to the pool, a place to set aside the things of the land before entering the things of the water. She set her shoes on it and the towel, and stood for a moment on the moss-covered ground in her bare feet. The moss was extraordinary underfoot. She had been wearing shoes since she left her house, and the sensation of the moss directly under the soles of her feet was immediate and complete, and rather overwhelming in the nicest possible sense. It was thick. Her feet sank into it slightly, not deeply, but perceptibly, the way feet sink into very good carpet, and the surface of it was soft in a way that nothing manufactured can replicate, because the softness of it was not uniform. It had variation, the variation of a living surface, of thousands of individual small plants growing in their particular directions and thicknesses, each one slightly different, so that the feel of it changed continuously under her feet as she shifted her weight, never quite the same twice. It was the opposite of the hard, flat, uniform surfaces she walked on almost every day. It was a surface that responded to her, not dramatically, not with engineered feedback, but with the honest, low-key, continuous responsiveness of something living. She stepped to the pool's edge and looked down. The water moved very slightly, a slow, nearly imperceptible circulation from the thermal source somewhere beneath. A movement so gentle it was visible only in the way the moon path on the surface shifted and rippled in long, unhurried waves. The temperature of the air she could feel near the surface was noticeably warmer than the air she had been standing in moments before, a warm zone, perhaps a foot above the water, where the heat and the steam accumulated before rising and dispersing. She stepped in. The sensation was she paused in the middle of it, 1 foot in the water and 1 on the moss. Because the sensation demanded a pause, demanded the full attention of every nerve in the foot that was submerged, demanded to be felt properly before she continued. The water was warm, genuinely, deeply, thoroughly warm, the warmth of thermal water that has been heated underground by something old and continuous and geological. Not the warmth of a bathtub that will cool progressively, but the warmth of a source, a constant, something that has been this temperature for a very long time and will continue to be this temperature regardless of what happens at the surface. It was warm the way the Earth's interior is warm, not from addition, but from fundamental nature. She stepped in with the other foot. The pool bottom was smooth under her feet. Those dark stones, warm from the water, fitted together without gaps in a surface that accommodated the foot's natural shape and provided neither the discomfort of gravel nor the sterility of a tiled surface, but something in between. A natural hardness with warmth, solid enough to stand on securely, warm enough to feel kind. She walked in slowly. The water received her by degrees, first her feet, then her ankles, each degree a new revelation, a new area of skin making its first contact with the warmth, and reporting back with the particular intensity of first contact, of something that has been cool meeting something warm. The body's immediate and involuntary recognition of a good thing. Past her knees, the water surrounded her legs completely, and the warmth became enveloping rather than touching, surrounding rather than contacting, and the sensation shifted from something discrete and identifiable to something total. Warmth as an environment rather than a sensation. Warmth as the medium she was moving through. Past her hips, she made a sound, a small, entirely involuntary sound, the kind that is not a word and not quite a sigh, but the low acoustic expression of a body meeting exactly what it needs at exactly the right moment. She did not feel embarrassed by it. There was no one to hear it, and even if there had been, she would not have felt embarrassed, because the sound was too honest for embarrassment, too simple and too true. The water reached her waist, her lower back, which carried a specific and long-standing tightness at the right side, old, familiar, something she had learned to manage rather than release, felt the warmth arrive at it, and responded with a loosening so immediate and so complete that she stopped walking and simply stood still in the middle of the pool with the water at her waist, and breathed through the feeling of something letting go that had been held for so long she had forgotten it was held. She stood in the middle of the pool and breathed. Then she did something she had not done in water in years, perhaps. She lay back, not dramatically, not all at once. She leaned back slowly, letting the water take her weight by increments, feeling the moment when the water's support became real and reliable, when she could lean further back than balance would ordinarily allow, when the water's buoyancy engaged and held her, when she could release the last of her physical self-management and let something else do the holding. She floated. She was on her back in the thermal pool under the full moon, looking up at the sky, and she was floating. And for a moment, a long, extraordinary moment, she felt weightless. Not truly weightless, not defying physics, but weightless in the experiential sense. The sense of a body that is not carrying its own weight, that has been relieved of the continuous unconscious labor of maintaining its own uprightness and structural integrity. That is being held entirely by something outside itself and can simply exist within that holding without contribution. The moon looked down at her. It was she searched for the right word and found she did not need one. It was what it was, which was the full moon of October over a thermal pool in a hidden clearing in a forest. And it looked down at her with the absolute indifference of the moon and the absolute beauty of the moon. And those two qualities together, the indifference and the beauty, the immensity and the light, produced in her something she could only call wonder. Clean, simple, undemanding wonder. The stars around the moon were sharp and numerous, and she looked at them with the same open, agendaless looking she had given them earlier on the walk. But from here, floating on her back with the warm water all around her, and the steam rising past her field of vision, and the cool night air on her face as the only coolness in a world of warmth, the looking was even more complete. She was looking up at the sky from inside the warmth of the earth, contained and held from below by the thermal water that had been heated by the earth's own interior, and now held her against it, held her against the earth itself with the deep, impersonal, entirely reliable warmth of something geological. And above her, the sky went on forever in the way that the sky does when you are lying down and looking at it directly, without the foreshortening that standing introduces. The way it becomes not a backdrop, but a destination, a depth you are looking into rather than a surface you are looking at. She spread her arms wide in the water. She felt the water fill the spaces under her arms and between her fingers with a gentle, pervasive warmth. She felt her spine release its last remaining curvature into the straight and honest line that it is under water, freed from gravity's habitual compression. She felt her neck lengthen. She felt her face, upturned to the moon, go smooth. She thought, this is what I have needed. Not the pool specifically. Not this exact collection of warm water and moonlight and thermal stone. But this, the experience of being completely held, of having literally nothing required of her, not maintenance, not contribution, not management of any kind, of being in a system so complete and self-sufficient that her only role within it was to exist, to float, to breathe, to look at the stars with open eyes. How rarely this happened. How rarely, in the texture of an ordinary life built of work and care, and the continuous gentle effort of being a responsible person in the world, she arrived at a moment where nothing was required. How quickly such moments, when they did occasionally appear, were filled with a phone, with a thought, with the restless reaching for the next thing that the mind does when it has been trained for too long on the production of output and does not know how to simply receive. She was receiving. She let the water hold her, and the moonlight reach her, and the thermal warmth rise through her, and the cool air touch her face, and the stars be numerous and brilliant above her. And she let all of it simply happen without organizing it or appreciating it in a self-conscious way or turning it into anything other than what it was. A fish, she felt it before she saw it. A brief, light movement against her calf, barely there. The gentlest possible contact. She tilted her head and caught a glimpse of it in the moonlit water below her. Small, pale, moving through the warm water with the effortless ease of something entirely at home in its element. Then gone, back into the jade depth, leaving only the faintest memory of its passing against her skin. She smiled, a real smile, reaching all the way to her eyes and beyond, the smile of someone who has been genuinely, unexpectedly delighted by something small. She floated on. The steam rose around her and dispersed into the cool air, and the moon moved imperceptibly, continuously, along its ancient path across the sky, and the trees at the clearing's edge stood in their dark silence, and the building behind her breathed its warm cedar breath through its pale stone walls, and the thermal water held her with the patience of something that has been warm for 1,000 years and will be warm for 1,000 more. And she floated in the center of it all, breathing slowly, open-palmed, looking at the stars. She did not know how long she floated. The moon did not tell her, and the water did not tell her, and she did not ask. She floated until she was ready to stop floating, and then she stood slowly and felt her weight return to her in the gentlest possible way. Not a burden resumed, but a simple fact re-encountered, familiar and uncomplaining. She walked to the pool's edge and stood for a moment in the shallow warmth, the night air on her upper body, the water still warm around her feet. Above her, the moon continued its ancient, unhurried transit. Behind her, through the pale wooden door. The rest of the evening waited, warm and prepared and patient. She was ready for it. She was ready for all of it.